The tone was sharp, unmistakable, and terrifying. It wasn't the standard chirp of a radar scan or a routine sweep from a distant tower. This was a hard fire control lock, a digital finger on a literal trigger. Somewhere out there, hidden by the morning haze over the Persian Gulf, an Iranian pilot had just committed to a lethal timeline. Inside the cockpit of the FA-18E Super Hornet, the threat receiver flashed red, screaming that a missile was seconds away from having a clear solution. There was no radio warning and no invitation to talk, just the sound of a machine preparing to kill. The pilot didn't wait for a second confirmation. He snapped the stick left, pulling a hard bank that pressed his body into the seat with punishing force. The horizon tilted violently as the blue sky vanished, replaced by the blinding sun glare reflecting off the flat surface of the Gulf. He dropped the nose, diving toward the water to use the surface clutter as a shield against the incoming beam. This wasn't a game of chicken or a routine intercept anymore. This was a direct confrontation where the margin for error had just been reduced to the width of a heartbeat. Down at 1,000 feet, then lower, the jet skimmed the heat shimmer above the waterline. The pilot's hands moved with the mechanical speed of 1,000 hours of training, arming countermeasures and activating the jammer. On the tactical frequency, his voice remained eerily flat, devoid of the adrenaline surging through his veins. Night 2-1, locked up, he reported. Single source, bearing 086. The response from the carrier strike group was equally cold. Night 2-1, copy, break low, maintain west, stand by. Those two words, stand by, carried the weight of a potential war. The Iranian radar wasn't wavering. Usually, these encounters involve a quick scan or a brief shadow, but this was a sustained, aggressive lock. It meant that somewhere in a hostile cockpit or at a ground-based console, a thumb was hovering over a launch button, waiting to see if the American pilot would flinch. The Hornet was now a machine flying inside a narrowing box of options. If he climbed, he became an easy target. If he turned too late, he was finished. Every movement had to be surgical, designed to break the tracking logic of a weapon system that was hungry for a hit. While the pilot fought the geometry of the lock, he wasn't alone, even if the sky looked empty. Far above and miles away, an E-2D Hawkeye was already dissecting the encounter, feeding high-resolution data to a cruiser sitting silently in the water below. The entire US Navy network was waking up, logging the specific electronic signature of the Iranian radar and mapping its weaknesses in real time. The Iranian pilot thought he was the hunter, but by keeping his radar active for so long, he was inadvertently handing over the keys to his own kingdom. He was feeding a library of his own destruction. Then came the call that changed the tactical math of the entire morning. Night 2-1, picture update. Second friendly in trail, you are not alone. A second US Navy fighter, which had been flying dark and silent, was now sliding into a supporting position. The Iranian pilot, focused entirely on the jet he had pinned down low, likely had no idea he was about to be bracketed. This is how the professionals reshape a fight without firing a single shot. You take the pressure, you absorb the aggression, and you wait for the moment the predator realizes he has stepped into a much larger cage. The Hornet pilot could finally see the threat with his own eyes. A gray silhouette emerged from the bright haze, twin tails and a sharp nose cutting through the air. It was an Iranian fighter, closing fast and holding a high offset position. It was a classic move, staying above the target to maintain a favorable look-down radar angle. The silhouette grew larger, the heat blur from its engines visible against the blue sky. Still, there was no radio contact. The silence from the Iranian side was becoming its own message, a heavy, suffocating pressure that signaled they weren't interested in talking. The American pilot's left hand rode the throttle with steady precision, refusing to give in to the urge for a sudden, emotional punch of speed. In a high-stakes intercept like this, the fastest way to lose is to fly with your head instead of your heart. He dropped the jet even lower, skimming the water so closely that the spray almost felt reachable. By dragging the fight down into the surface clutter, he was forcing the Iranian radar to work twice as hard to distinguish the aircraft from the waves. It was a test of skill and technology, and the Iranian pilot was starting to find the solution difficult. The lock tone on the headset began to flicker and stutter. It wasn't gone, but it was losing its grip. This was the first sign that the defensive maneuvers and electronic countermeasures were actually working. The Iranian pilot was being forced to recompute, to struggle for the tracking solution he had previously held with ease. But instead of backing off, the hostile jet pushed harder, tightening its turn and trying to force the Hornet into a predictable escape line. It was a dangerous escalation, a move that brought the two aircraft closer to a collision or a shoot-down than anyone on either side wanted. Behind the Iranian fighter, the second American jet was now in a lethal position, holding the geometry with cold discipline. They hadn't turned on their radar yet, choosing instead to remain an invisible threat. This was the psychological core of the encounter. The Iranian pilot was beginning to sense that the air around him was no longer empty. Aviators have a sixth sense for when an intercept starts becoming a layered problem. He was hunting one hornet, but he was starting to feel the presence of a ghost. The tactical advantage he thought he had was evaporating into the salt air of the Gulf. Inside the U.S. tactical network, the instructions were clear: hold discipline, do not climb, and do not illuminate. The U.S. Navy was refusing to be the side that turned this ugly encounter into a shooting war. No hot-headed moves, no aggressive radar bursts, just perfect composure under fire. This frustrated the Iranian pilot's intent. If he wanted a reaction, he wasn't getting the one he expected. He was met with a wall of professional silence and a target that refused to be intimidated. Every second the lock remained, the Iranian was exposing more of his tactics to the listeners on the other side. The pressure in the cockpit was reaching a boiling point. The threat receiver would glow bright for several seconds, then dim as the pilot jinked the Hornet, only to roar back to life as the Iranian pilot compensated. It was a dance performed at hundreds of miles per hour, just feet above a featureless sea. One minor mistake, one twitch of the hand, and the aircraft would cartwheel into the water. But the Hornet pilot didn't flinch. He used the lateral displacement of the jet to wreck the geometry of the intercept, making himself a nightmare for the Iranian tracking systems to follow. At this altitude, even the air feels thick and unforgiving. The engine note of the Super Hornet deepened as the pilot held his speed, refusing to bleed energy in a way that would make him vulnerable. He watched the Iranian jet adjust its nose position again, trying to regain the dominant line. It was a moment where intent becomes heavier than fuel or weapons. The Iranian pilot was deciding whether to cross the final threshold. If he held the lock much longer, the U.S. rules of engagement might shift from defensive maneuvering to active threat neutralization. The clock was ticking. Suddenly, the second U.S. fighter made its presence known in the most subtle way possible. It wasn't a radio shout. It was a shift in the air picture that the Iranian pilot could no longer ignore. Night 2-1, support crossing into your 6-high, bracket now. The trap was finally set. The Iranian jet was now caught between two American fighters, one low and one high, one visible and one lurking. The aggression that had fueled the Iranian pilot for the last few minutes was suddenly replaced by the cold reality of being outmatched and outpositioned. He was no longer the one in control. The air became heavy with the weight of what might happen next. In these moments, speed and altitude stop being the most important things in the sky. What matters is the realization that every move you make is being logged, replayed, and judged by a system designed to exploit your every mistake. The Iranian pilot looked down at his own displays, seeing the lock tone flicker and fail as the second Hornet entered his awareness. The realization must have been jarring. The aircraft he tried to pin down was never as alone as it looked, and his own safety was now a matter of American restraint. The hostile jet's nose began to drift. It was a tiny movement, one that a civilian observer would never notice, but to the pilots in the air, it was everything. It was the first sign of a retreat. The Iranian pilot was no longer tightening the turn. He was starting to think about separation. The aggressive angle he had held since the beginning was softening, the closure rate was dropping, and the posture was shifting from intimidation to reconsideration. He had pushed the line as far as he could without breaking it, and now he was looking for a way out before the bracket closed. Despite the shift, the Hornet pilot stayed defensive. He knew that a retreat announced too early can often be a trap. He kept the jet low, eyes scanning the horizon and the threat display, waiting for the lock to break completely. On the radio, the controllers remained calm, providing updates on the Iranian pilot's emissions. Hostile emission degrading. Support remained set. The American system was working like a well-oiled machine, absorbing the Iranian aggression and turning it into a tactical lesson. They had the data, they had the position, and they had the moral high ground. For one long second, the threat receiver glowed with a final, steady pulse. It was like a last gasp of defiance from the Iranian side. The Hornet pilot held his breath, hands steady on the stick, refusing to give the Iranian pilot any reason to re-engage. Then, the tone finally changed. It didn't end with a bang or a missile plume. It simply weakened, fading from a hard weapons-grade lock to a soft search sweep. The digital grip that had defined the last few minutes was finally slipping away. The Iranian pilot had blinked first, realizing that the cost of pressing further was too high. The Iranian jet pulled away, turning back toward the coast and breaking the engagement geometry. The separation increased rapidly as the hostile pilot put distance between himself and the two American fighters. The Super Hornet finally climbed away from the water, the pilot feeling the sudden release of the crushing pressure that had dominated the cockpit. The Gulf below, which had been a blur of blue and white, now looked calm and indifferent again. But the data recorded in those few minutes would be analyzed for months, providing a perfect map of how Iran probes American defenses. No missile was fired that morning, and no warning shots were necessary. The U.S. Navy had won the encounter through discipline and the invisible strength of its network. By refusing to panic and by bringing in layered support, they turned a potential crisis into a demonstration of total control. The Iranian pilot had tried to turn a radar lock into leverage, but instead he handed the Americans exactly what they needed. He showed them how he fights, how his radar behaves under stress, and exactly how far he is willing to go before he loses his nerve in the face of a superior force. The two U.S. fighters reformed their flight, flying in a tight, professional formation as they returned to their patrol route. There was no chest thumping on the radio, and no theatrical maneuvers to taunt the retreating Iranian. That is not how professionals operate in the high-stakes environment of the Persian Gulf. The goal wasn't to start a war, it was to hold the line and prove that the sky wasn't as open as the Iranian pilot thought. They had faced a hard lock, navigated a lethal trap, and come out the other side without breaking a single rule of engagement. It was a victory of composure. As the sun rose higher over the water, the memory of the warning tone began to fade, but the lesson remained. Over the Gulf, survival comes first, then discipline, and finally the trap. What forced the Iranian radar to break wasn't noise or anger. It was the quiet, terrifying efficiency of a system that refuses to lose control. The Iranian pilot lit the warning tone, but the U.S. Navy controlled everything that followed. It was a silent message sent across the electronic spectrum. You can watch us, and you can even aim at us, but you will never be the one who decides how the story ends. This encounter serves as a chilling reminder of how quickly a routine patrol can turn into a moment that changes history. In the cockpit of a Super Hornet, there is no room for theater or ego, only the cold math of survival. Every time an Iranian radar locks onto an American jet, it is a test of will that stretches from the cockpit all the way to the halls of power. On this day, the line held. But as long as these two forces share the same sky, the next sharp tone is always just a heartbeat away, waiting to see who will be the first to blink when the lock turns solid.